The October sun blazed mercilessly over Willow Springs as townsfolk gathered around the courthouse steps, their weathered faces etched with the uncomfortable resignation that frontier life demanded when legal matters turned ugly. The air hung thick with dust and tension, broken only by the restless stomping of horses and the low murmur of voices discussing what they were about to witness. Julia Morrison stood on the wooden platform, iron shackles catching the harsh light at her wrists, while auctioneer Walsh shuffled through the territorial matrimonial contract papers with obvious distaste. At 20, she possessed the kind of beauty that could stop conversations, wheat gold hair that caught sunlight like spun silk emerald eyes that blazed with defiance despite her circumstances, and the steel backbone that marked true frontier women. By order of the territorial court, Walsh announced reluctantly, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Miss Julia Morrison, age 20, unmarried and without independent means, is hereby offered in court-ordered guardianship indenture to settle the accumulated debts of her guardian Hugh Morrison, $912 plus accrued interest and court costs. The crowd stirred uneasily. Even on this harsh frontier where survival often trumped sentiment, the sight of a young woman being bound in marriage to pay another's debts sat poorly with decent folk. But territorial law was explicit. Unmarried women without property could be contracted in matrimonial bonds to settle family obligations threatening community stability. Opening bid $50 for matrimonial rights to Miss Morrison. Walsh continued each word, seeming to pain him. Terms include assumption of all debts plus provision for the lady's proper Christian maintenance. Thunder of approaching hooves cut through the tension, 4 riders cresting the eastern ridge, moving with the controlled grace of men born to the saddle. The lead rider commanded immediate attention as he drew closer. Tall and lean on a paint stallion, his long obsidian hair was adorned with 3 eagle feathers that marked his status among the Lakota people. The jagged scar running from his left shoulder to his elbow spoke of battles survived and enemies defeated. Nahiosi, 28 years old and bearing the weight of his people's hopes for peaceful coexistence, had come to negotiate winter grazing rights. But as his coal dark eyes swept the scene before him, all thoughts of peaceful trade negotiations vanished. "Don't you recognize me, Lakota warrior?" The voice cut through the crowd's murmur like tempered steel through leather. Julia's emerald eyes were fixed directly on Nahiosi with desperate intensity that seemed to reach across the space between them. "I'm the girl from the blizzard. You saved my family." With her bound hands, she managed to lift a small beaded ornament from beneath her collar, a fox charm worked in crimson and ivory beads, its colors still vivid despite years of wear. Nahiosi's scarred hand moved instinctively to his medicine pouch, where an identical charm rested the mate to the one he'd carved for a lost child during a winter storm 10 years past. The memory hit him like a physical blow. A white family near death from cold sheltered in his mother's lodge during the worst blizzard anyone could remember. $75, a gruff voice shouted, breaking the spell. 100, called another bidder. Magnus Caldwell pushed through the assembled crowd with predatory confidence. The mine owner commanded attention through more than wealth. His pale gray eyes held the cold intelligence of a man who viewed people as chess pieces to be moved at will. His expensive Eastern clothing stood in stark contrast to the rough frontier garb of other bidders. $200. Magnus announced, his cultured accent cutting through rougher frontier drawls. Cash payment for immediate possession to spare the lady further embarrassment. But Nahiosi dismounted with fluid grace, his hand resting on the bone handle of his knife, not threatening, but ready. "The auction ends here," he said quietly, his voice carrying natural authority. Sheriff Rusty Joe stepped forward, hand on his gun butt. "This here's legal territorial business, Redskin. You got no standing to interfere. She claims kinship with my people. That gives me standing. Magnus's calculating gaze sharpened. He'd built his empire through legal manipulation, recognizing complications when they arose. Interesting claim, but legally irrelevant. The debt requires settlement through court-ordered guardianship indenture, unless you're prepared to assume Morrison's obligations personally. The challenge hung in the air, like smoke from a grass fire. Around them, rifles glinted as the crowd sensed violence brewing. Nahiosi looked directly at Julia, seeing past the shackles to the blazing courage in her eyes. This was the frightened child who had clutched his gift during that long-ago blizzard, now grown into a woman facing impossible odds with unbroken spirit. "I will match any legitimate bid," he said simply. $300. Magnus countered immediately. 300. 500. 500. The bidding war escalated until Magnus offered $700, a fortune that represented more money than most settlers saw in 5 years of labor. "Where's a savage getting that kind of currency?" Greasy Pete snarled, spitting tobacco juice near Nahiosi's feet. Instead of answering, Nahiosi produced a leather bag, pouring its contents onto the courthouse steps. Gold coins scattered across the planks, double eagles and half eagles that caught the sunlight like captured flame. Payment in full. United States gold currency acceptable. Walsh looked to Sheriff Joe, who nodded reluctantly. Territorial law required accepting legitimate currency regardless of its source. "Sold to..." Walsh paused, not knowing the buyer's name. "Nahiosi of the Oglala Lakota. The woman comes with me." But as Nahiosi stepped forward, Magnus raised his hand. "Not so fast. Territorial law requires a 24-hour posting period for a marriage petition. Failure to appear voids it. Miss Morrison remains in town custody until legal requirements are fulfilled." Sheriff Joe nodded. "That's the law. Lady stays in town tonight under proper supervision. Wedding tomorrow at noon." Julia's heart sank as she realized Magnus had maneuvered them into an impossible position. One night provided ample time for accidents to occur, but Nahiosi's expression remained calm. "Terms accepted, but I also remain in town to protect my investment." "Your investment will receive proper supervision," Magnus assured him with a dangerous smile. As the crowd dispersed, Julia caught Nahiosi's eye one final time. 10 years had transformed the young warrior into a man marked by battle and loss. But something essential remained, the unwavering determination to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The deadly game was far from over, but at least now she had an ally who remembered a frightened child and the gift of kindness offered without expecting return. The northern plains of Dakota Territory in 1878 stretched endlessly beneath autumn's sky, marked by rolling grassland where vast buffalo herds had once grazed. Willow Springs had grown around natural water, where Willow Creek meandered through shallow valley, providing reliable access that made permanent settlement possible in this harsh land. Magnus Caldwell had recognized the area's potential when he'd arrived 2 years earlier, with Eastern capital and territorial political connections. His coal dust mine employed 30 men, but the operation's primary value lay in legitimizing his presence, while providing cover for less legal activities. Over 2 careful years, he'd built an extensive network of corrupt officials and gradually extended his influence over virtually every aspect of local commerce. Sheriff Rusty Joe epitomized this corruption, enforcing Magnus's will as often as territorial law, supplementing his salary with generous private payments. His deputy, Quiet Will Henderson, represented a different kind of compromise. An honest man by nature, Will had been drawn into Magnus's web through desperation. His wife lay dying of consumption, and the expensive medicine she required could only be obtained through Magnus's controlled supply networks. Dr. Remy provided stark contrast to the prevailing corruption. A former Army surgeon seeking quieter life after too many battlefield amputations, he maintained his practice with scrupulous honesty. Despite financial pressures, Magnus's monopolistic practices created. Miss Nora taught school on the town's edge, officially serving only white children, but secretly educating Lakota youngsters whose families recognized the importance of understanding white customs. Her activities violated territorial regulations, but she'd never let legal technicalities interfere with doing right. Julia Morrison's presence in this tangled web had come through frontier tragedy. She'd traveled west 3 months earlier with her father Robert and Uncle Hugh, part of the great immigration wave following railroad expansion. But their journey had ended in violence when raiders attacked their wagon train at Raven's Gap. Robert Morrison had died defending his family, while Hugh took a serious chest wound that left him struggling to establish his homestead, 160 acres of rich bottomland called Golden Field. When infection set in, Hugh had turned to Dr. Remy, beginning a mounting cycle of medical expenses. Magnus had stepped forward with seemingly generous offer covering medical costs in exchange for future water rights considerations. The contract Hugh signed during fevered recovery was deliberately vague, allowing Magnus broad interpretation when collection time came. As Hugh's health improved, he discovered his debt had grown far beyond original expenses, compounded by crushing interest rates, making repayment impossible. Julia had worked tirelessly alongside her uncle, but their efforts were systematically undermined by Magnus's control over supply routes. When Sheriff Joe arrived with default papers, Julia demanded to examine documentation, discovering obvious discrepancies suggesting fraud. That prompted Magnus to reveal his ultimate strategy, since Hugh couldn't pay in currency, and Julia was unmarried with no legal standing. Territorial law provided court-ordered guardianship indenture as debt settlement. But Julia's recognition of Nahiosi had introduced an unexpected variable. The beaded charm represented connections transcending the racial divisions. Magnus exploited connections that might prove strong enough to disrupt his schemes. That precious charm had been crafted during winter 1868, when Julia's family became lost in an early blizzard while traveling through Lakota territory. Nahiosi, then 18 and eager to prove his worth, had been part of the hunting party that found the freezing settlers and brought them to his band's winter camp. During 3 days of shelter, young Nahiosi had carved the fox charm from buffalo bone and decorated it with traditional beadwork, intending it as gift for the frightened white child, who reminded him of his younger sister lost to fever. The gesture was simple kindness, offered without expecting return. Julia had treasured the charm through the years, as a reminder that kindness could exist in harshest circumstances, while Nahiosi carried its twin as reminder of innocence that war had stolen. Now, 10 years later, that shared memory represented their only hope in a situation designed to destroy them both. As evening shadows lengthened across Willow Springs, both understood they faced what might be their final night. Magnus hadn't built his empire by accepting defeat gracefully, and Nahiosi's intervention had transformed routine debt collection into direct challenge to his authority. Just after midnight, when Willow Springs had settled into uneasy sleep, the acrid smell of smoke began drifting through Julia's window. She woke instantly, recognizing danger even in sleep. The orange glow on the horizon told the story prairie fire, and it was spreading fast. Through her window, she glimpsed a figure moving deliberately through the darkness, splashing coal oil on dry grass upwind of Nahiosi's camp. Greasy Pete following Magnus's orders to eliminate inconvenient witnesses while making it look like Indian raids. The fire caught with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the entire creek bottom blazed flames, leaping 20 feet high as drought-parched grass fed the inferno. The wind began to gust unpredictably, pushing the fire toward town. Julia's boarding house keeper had rushed outside to help organize evacuation, leaving Julia's door unlocked in the chaos. Using a hairpin and skills her father had taught her, Julia picked the lock on her shackles and slipped into the night. The scene that greeted her was hell on earth. Smoke rolled across the prairie in choking waves, and the heat was so intense it singed her hair from 100 yards away. Animals screamed in terror, and the air itself seemed to burn her lungs with each breath. Through the smoke and chaos, she saw Nahiosi emerging from the fire, like something from mankind's oldest nightmares. Wrapped in a buffalo robe, soaked with creek water, he was carrying the unconscious form of young Red Hawk, who'd been overcome by smoke while trying to save their horses. "The horses!" Nahiosi shouted over the roar of flames. "They're trapped in the draw." Meet. Without thinking, Julia grabbed a bucket and soaked her dress, following Nahiosi toward the blazing draw where terrified whinnies echoed like sounds from hell itself. The paint stallion and 3 other horses were trapped by walls of fire on 3 sides, their eyes white with terror. Working together with desperate efficiency, they began creating a fire break using wet blankets and their own bodies as shields. Julia's hands blistered from handling burning branches, but she didn't stop. Nahiosi's buffalo robe was beginning to smolder, but he kept working his movements calm despite the chaos. The crucial moment came when they had to lead the horses through a narrow gap in the flames. The animals balked, terrified of fire. But Nahiosi began singing in Lakota, a low hypnotic chant that seemed to calm them. Julia found herself adding her voice, humming along with a melody she'd never heard, but somehow understood. One by one, they led the horses through the gap, Julia taking the lead rope, while Nahiosi shielded them with his smoldering robe. The last horse, a young mare, panicked midway through and reared, nearly striking Julia in the head. Nahiosi's reflexes saved her, his arms sweeping around her waist to pull her against his chest as the mare's hooves passed inches from where her head had been. For a heartbeat, they stood locked together in the narrow passage between walls of fire, her body pressed against his, both breathing hard from exertion and adrenaline. She could feel his heart hammering against her back, could smell the smoke in his hair mixed with something uniquely him, leather and sage, and something wild and clean. Then the moment passed, and they were through, leading the horses to safety as the fire began to die down behind them. "You came back," Nahiosi said quietly, as they stood watching the horses mill nervously in their temporary safety. "I couldn't leave you to face it alone," Julia replied, suddenly aware that her dress was torn and singed, her face streaked with soot. But there was no time for further conversation. Sheriff Joe was arriving with a hastily assembled posse, his expression making clear he wasn't interested in hearing about heroic rescues. "Arrest them both," he ordered. "Indians setting fires just like Magnus said would happen." Dr. Remy stepped forward from the crowd of firefighters. "That's a lie, and you know it, Rusty Joe. I saw them fighting the fire, not setting it." "You got any proof of that, Doc?" Before Dr. Remy could answer, Quiet Will appeared from the shadows, his face grim with conflicted loyalty. "Sheriff, I found these at the point of origin." He held up an empty coal oil can and a distinctive tobacco pouch that everyone recognized as belonging to Greasy Pete. Sheriff Joe's face darkened. "Could have been planted. Or it could be evidence that someone's been lying to you about what really happened here tonight," Dr. Remy said firmly. "I'm going with them to make sure nobody has any more accidents." What followed was a harrowing escape, aided by Quiet Will's deliberate misdirection and Miss Nora's provision of fresh horses and supplies. Within an hour of the fire's outbreak, Julia found herself riding through pre-dawn darkness beside the Lakota warrior who'd risked everything to buy her freedom. As they rode north toward the Badlands, she pressed close against Nahiosi's back for warmth and security, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the controlled strength that had carried her from certain death into uncertain freedom. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly, her words nearly lost in the prairie wind. "Risk everything for someone you hadn't seen in 10 years. Nahiosi was quiet for so long, she thought he hadn't heard. Then, without turning around, he replied in a voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "My mother used to say that the spirits send us exactly the people we need when we need them most. That little girl in the blizzard taught me something about courage, how someone small and frightened could still face the storm and keep going. I never forgot that lesson." Julia felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the buffalo robe wrapped around them both. "What did she teach you?" "That real strength isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway." The conversation ended there, but something had been acknowledged between them that went beyond gratitude or temporary alliance. They were partners now bound by shared danger and growing understanding of what they meant to each other. The Badlands stretched before them like something from another world, wind-carved sandstone formations, hidden canyons, and secret water sources known only to those who'd learned to read the land's ancient language. It was here that they would make their stand, plan their counterattack, and discover whether the bonds forged in childhood innocence were strong enough to overcome the forces seeking to destroy them. The Badlands rose before them like a moonscape carved by wind and time, all twisted sandstone spires and hidden arroyos that could swallow a man without trace. As dawn broke gray and cold over the ancient formations, Julia felt the full weight of their situation settling upon her shoulders. They were fugitives now, branded as criminals by Magnus's corrupt machinery. Nahiosi guided his paint stallion with unconscious skill, reading the land's subtle language. Every rock formation, every change in the wind's direction, told him something about their surroundings. This was knowledge passed down through generations' hard-won wisdom that meant the difference between life and death in country that showed no mercy to the unprepared. "There," he said quietly, pointing toward what appeared to be solid rock face. "We'll find shelter there." Julia squinted against the morning glare, seeing nothing but weathered stone and shadows. But as they drew closer, she began to make out the narrow opening concealed behind wind-carved formations, a hidden canyon that opened into sanctuary, like the secret entrance to another world. The canyon was perhaps 50 yards wide, its walls rising 100 feet on either side, carved into fantastic shapes by millennia of wind and rare but violent floods. At its heart lay a small oasis, a spring-fed pool surrounded by cottonwoods and wild grass, sheltered from the wind and invisible from outside. "My grandfather showed me this place when I was 12. Nahiosi explained as he helped Julia down from the horse. "Said it was where the spirits came to drink in the old days, before the white man's guns drove them deeper into the earth." Dr. Remy and the others arrived shortly after leading Red Hawk on a makeshift travois. The young warrior was conscious, but still weak from smoke inhalation, his breathing labored and painful. Julia immediately set about preparing a place for him to rest, drawing on healing knowledge her mother had taught her. "Willow bark for the lung inflammation," she murmured, gathering branches from the trees around the spring. "And we'll need to keep his chest elevated to help him breathe." As she worked, Julia became aware of Nahiosi watching her with something approaching wonder. "You know healing," he observed. "My mother taught me before she died." Julia replied, not looking up from her preparation of medicinal tea. She said a woman who couldn't heal was only half a woman, especially on the frontier where doctors were scarce and death was always close. The days that followed tested them all in ways none had anticipated. The Badlands provided shelter, but survival required constant vigilance and hard work. Water had to be carefully rationed despite the spring. Food was scarce rabbits and sage hens, when Nahiosi's hunting was successful wild plants and roots when it wasn't. The nights were cold, requiring them to share warmth around carefully concealed fires. But it was during these hardships that Julia and Nahiosi began to truly know each other as more than allies thrown together by circumstance. Working side by side to tend Red Hawk's injuries, to prepare meals from meager provisions, to maintain their weapons and equipment, they developed the kind of wordless communication that marked true partnerships. Julia proved herself far from the helpless Eastern lady that Magnus's men had expected. She learned to read weather signs and animal tracks, to move silently through brush, to load and clean rifles. Her hands, already calloused from farm work, grew harder still, but her spirit seemed to grow stronger with each challenge overcome. "You're not what I expected," Nahiosi admitted one evening as they sat beside the spring, sharing the last of their coffee, while Red Hawk slept nearby. "What did you expect?" Julia asked, genuinely curious. "When I saw you on that platform, I thought, a white woman raised in towns, used to soft living. I thought I'd bought myself a burden that would need constant protection." He paused, stirring the fire with a stick. "I was wrong." Julia felt warmth that had nothing to do with the flames spread through her chest. "I've had to learn to be strong. After my father died, after we came west, I realized that the frontier doesn't care about what you used to be. It only cares about what you can become." The conversation that followed lasted deep into the night, two people sharing the stories that had shaped them. Julia spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her mother's death from fever, her father's dreams of building something better in the West. Nahiosi told her of his mother's wisdom, his training as a warrior, the gradual understanding that his people's traditional ways would have to adapt or disappear entirely. She used to say that the Spirit sent us exactly the challenges we needed to become who we were meant to be. He said, speaking of his mother with reverence that made Julia's heart ache. "When I was young, I thought that meant challenges and battle tests of courage and strength. Now I think she meant something deeper." "What do you think she meant?" "Learning to see beyond the surface of things. Understanding that enemies can become allies, that strangers can become family, that the heart doesn't recognize the boundaries that minds create." Julia felt her breath catch at the intensity in his voice, at the way his eyes held hers across the firelight. Something was happening between them that went far beyond gratitude or temporary alliance. A recognition that ran deeper than conscious thought, as if their souls were remembering a connection and their minds had never quite forgotten. It was during their second week in the canyon that Julia's analytical mind began to piece together the pattern of events that had brought them here. Sitting by the spring while Nahiosi worked on repairing damaged equipment, she found herself reviewing everything with methodical precision. "It's all connected," she said suddenly, the realization hitting her with the force of revelation. Nahiosi looked up from the rifle he was cleaning. "What's connected?" "Everything. My father's death, Uncle Hugh's injury, the debt that couldn't be paid, even your presence in town that day." Julia stood and began pacing, her mind racing as pieces fell into place. Magnus didn't just take advantage of opportunities, he created them. Dr. Remy looked up from where he was tending Red Hawk. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," Julia said, excitement building despite the grim implications. "My father was a surveyor. He knew this territory, knew which lands had value and which didn't. If he'd completed his work, filed his reports with the territorial office, it would have established legal precedent for water rights and land claims throughout the valley, which would have interfered with Magnus's schemes." Nahiosi observed, understanding beginning to dawn. "Exactly. So the wagon train attack wasn't random banditry, it was targeted assassination designed to eliminate someone whose professional knowledge threatened Magnus's plans. Julia's voice grew harder as she worked through the implications. Uncle Hugh's wound wasn't just collateral damage. It was deliberate, calculated to leave him alive, but dependent, vulnerable to Magnus's generosity. Miss Nora, who had been quietly mending torn clothing, looked up with horror. "You're suggesting that Magnus arranged your father's murder?" "I'm not suggesting it," Julia replied grimly. "I'm stating it as fact, and I think I know how to prove it." The plan Julia proposed was audacious to the point of recklessness, but it was their only realistic chance of obtaining the evidence they needed to expose Magnus's crimes. They would have to return to Willow Springs, not as fugitives hiding in shadows, but as investigators gathering proof of systematic corruption and murder. "His office at the mine," Julia explained as they gathered around the fire to discuss her proposal. "Magnus keeps detailed records of everything. It's his weakness. He's so convinced of his own cleverness, so certain that his power makes him untouchable, that he documents his crimes like a merchant recording legitimate transactions. Getting into that office would be suicide," Dr. Remy protested. "The man has armed guards posted around the clock, and after what happened with the fire, he'll be expecting us to make some kind of move." "Not if we're clever about it," Julia countered. During the day, Magnus maintains his facade of respectability. He keeps the guards out of sight to maintain the appearance of legitimate business. And I have an idea about how to get inside without arousing suspicion. What she proposed was breathtakingly bold. She would present herself at Magnus's office, requesting a meeting to discuss reconsidering the marriage arrangement in light of recent events. While she distracted him with negotiations, Nahiosi would search his private files for the evidence they needed. "It's too dangerous," Nahiosi said flatly. "If he suspects anything, then we'll fight our way out," Julia interrupted. "But we need proof of what he's done, real evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. Without it, we're just fugitives making wild accusations." The debate continued through the night, but eventually they all recognized that Julia's plan, dangerous as it was, represented their best chance of exposing Magnus's crimes before he could eliminate them permanently. They spent 2 days planning every detail of the infiltration. Nahiosi would position himself where he could observe the office and provide backup if needed. Dr. Remy and Miss Nora would remain with Red Hawk, ready to spread word of their discoveries if the mission went wrong. As dawn broke on the appointed day, Julia and Nahiosi made their final preparations. She had borrowed one of Miss Nora's better dresses, transforming herself back into the appearance of a proper young lady despite their weeks in the wilderness. He had cleaned and checked his weapons, preparing for the kind of close-quarters combat that might be necessary if their deception was discovered. "If something goes wrong," Julia said as they prepared to leave the canyon, "promise me you won't try to be a hero. Get away. Take the evidence. Make sure people know the truth." Nahiosi took her hands in his, looking directly into her eyes. "Nothing will go wrong. We've planned too carefully, prepared too well. But if something does happen..." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the most alive I've felt since my mother died. Whatever happens, you've given me back something I thought was lost forever." Julia felt tears prick her eyes at the intensity in his voice. "What have I given you back?" "Hope," he said simply. "The belief that people can change, that enemies can become friends, that love is possible even in the darkest times." The word hung between them like a bridge across the cultural divide that had seemed so insurmountable just weeks before. Love. Neither had spoken it before, but both recognized its truth in the depths of their souls. Without conscious thought, Julia rose on her toes and kissed him a gentle meeting of lips that conveyed everything words could not express. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard and their eyes wide with the recognition of what had just been acknowledged between them. "When this is over," Nahiosi said softly, "when Magnus is stopped and justice is done, I want to court you properly. Learn your customs, meet your family, do things the way they should be done." Julia smiled through her tears. "When this is over, we'll have time for proper courtship. But right now, we have work to do." The ride back to Willow Springs took most of the morning, their horses picking their way carefully through terrain that offered concealment from pursuing search parties. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the town, both could see that their absence had not gone unnoticed. Armed men patrolled the streets, and a new gallows had been erected in the town square, a grim reminder of what awaited them if their mission failed. "Last chance to change your mind," Nahiosi said quietly. Julia's reply was to spur her horse forward down the slope toward town. "Let's go get our evidence." Magnus's office occupied the entire second floor of the building that housed the First Bank of Willow Springs, a substantial structure that spoke of prosperity and permanence. The man himself received Julia with the kind of oily charm that made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to smile and play the role of a woman reconsidering her options. "My dear Miss Morrison," Magnus said, rising from behind his massive oak desk. "How delightful to see you looking so well after your recent adventures. I do hope you've come to your senses about this unfortunate misunderstanding." "I've had time to think, Mr. Caldwell," Julia replied, allowing just a hint of breathlessness to enter her voice. "Perhaps I was hasty in my judgments. The frontier is so harsh for a woman alone, and you offer security." While she played the helpless female, drawing Magnus into detailed explanations of the generous terms he was prepared to offer for their marriage, Nahiosi slipped through the rear window and began his systematic search of the office files. What he found exceeded their worst expectations. Financial records showing payments to G. Pete for property clearing services at Raven's Gap. Correspondence with railroad executives discussing water rights acquisitions. Maps marking Lakota winter camps with notations about obstacles to development. But the most damning evidence was a handwritten letter in Magnus's own script addressed to Greasy Pete and dated just days before the Morrison wagon train attack. The surveyor Morrison must not be allowed to complete his territorial mapping. His reports would establish water precedents that interfere with railroad development. Eliminate him and wound his brother enough to create dependency. Make it look like random banditry. Another letter dated 3 years earlier was even more explicit. The old squaw at Prairie Rose Creek continues to refuse sale of tribal lands. Her influence prevents other Indians from accepting our offers. Arrange an accident that removes her while appearing to be retaliation for recent raids. Use Pete's men, but ensure no connection to our operations. The letters were signed with Magnus's distinctive flourish, legal proof of his direct involvement in multiple murders. Nahiosi photographed them quickly. With the graphite rubbings and copied ledger pages, Dr. Remy had provided his hands steady despite the magnitude of their discovery. But their investigation was interrupted by Magnus's growing suspicion about Julia's sudden change of heart. Her performance had been flawless, but the man's instincts were too sharp to be completely fooled by even the most skillful deception. "You know, my dear," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge as he moved closer to where she sat. "I'm beginning to think you're not quite as helpless as you pretend to be. In fact, I'm wondering if this visit might have an ulterior motive." Julia's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mr. Caldwell." "I think you know exactly what I mean." And I suspect your savage friend is somewhere in this building right now, looking for things that don't belong to him. The office door burst open as two of Magnus's gunmen entered with weapons drawn. But Nahiosi was already moving, diving through the front window in a shower of glass, as bullets shattered the air where he'd been standing. Julia threw herself behind Magnus's heavy desk as the gun battle erupted around her, her hands covering her head as wood splinters and plastered dust rained down from the walls. But she could hear Nahiosi's Winchester speaking from the street below, driving Magnus's men back from the windows with precisely placed shots that demonstrated his military training. The sound of his rifle was the most beautiful music she'd ever heard, proof that he was alive and fighting. That's when she noticed Magnus reaching for a hidden drawer in his desk and the small derringer concealed inside. Without thinking, Julia lunged forward, grabbing his wrist, just as he brought the weapon to bear on Nahiosi's position outside. They struggled for control of the gun, Magnus's superior size and strength gradually overwhelming her smaller frame. "You little fool." He snarled, his cultured facade finally dropping completely. "Did you really think you could outsmart me? I've been planning this railroad development for years, eliminating every obstacle that stood in my way. Your father, that old squaw, all the other fools who didn't understand that progress requires sacrifice." The confession was exactly what they needed if they lived long enough to use it. Julia could feel her strength failing as Magnus's finger tightened on the trigger, the derringer's barrel swinging toward the window, where Nahiosi was pinned down by rifle fire. But their salvation came from an unexpected source. Quiet Will Henderson appeared in the doorway, his deputy's badge glinting in the afternoon sunlight, his service revolver steady in both hands. "Let her go, Magnus. It's over." Magnus laughed, a sound devoid of all sanity. "Over. This is just the beginning. When the federal troops arrive, they'll clean out every Indian nest from here to the Canadian border. My railroad will run through a pacified territory, and I'll be the richest man west of Chicago." "Maybe," Quiet Will agreed, "but you won't be alive to see it." The shot echoed through the office like thunder. Magnus spun around, clutching his shoulder, the derringer flying from his grasp. Julia scrambled away from him as Quiet Will kept his weapon trained on the wounded mine owner. "I've been listening to you for 10 minutes, the deputy said grimly. "Heard every word about the murders, the railroad scheme, all of it. That's enough testimony to hang you 5 times over." Outside, the gun battle was winding down as more townspeople arrived, drawn by the sound of shooting and finally ready to stand up to Magnus's corrupt regime. Dr. Remy appeared with his medical bag, tending to wounds on both sides with professional impartiality. But their victory came with sobering news. Miss Nora arrived breathless. With word that federal cavalry was less than a day's ride away, their commanding officer convinced by Magnus's lies that an Indian uprising was in progress. "We need more than confessions and documents," Julia said as they gathered in Dr. Remy's office to plan their next move. "We need to expose his crimes in front of witnesses who can't be bought or intimidated." That's when they learned about Magnus's final desperate gambit. Despite his wounds and capture, he had contingency plans in place. Greasy Pete was already moving to implement the false flag operation that would provide evidence of Indian hostility for the arriving federal troops. The Agency Day school, Quiet Will explained. "Pete's planning to burn it tonight and leave evidence that makes it look like Nahiosi and his warriors did it. With the building destroyed and Magnus's planted witnesses ready to testify, the cavalry will have all the justification they need for a general campaign against the Lakota." The school sat in an isolated valley, 15 miles north of town, a single-room log building where government teachers attempted to assimilate Indian children into white culture. It was the perfect target for Magnus's purposes, symbolic, vulnerable, and far enough from town that Pete's men could work without interference. But it was also their opportunity. If they could catch the arsonists in the act and prevent the building's destruction, they could prove once and for all that the supposed Indian uprising was entirely manufactured. The plan they developed required splitting their small force and accepting risks that bordered on suicidal. Miss Nora would position herself to document the arsonists' identities. Quiet Will would provide backup and legal authority. So did Ekatars. Remy would remain in town to treat casualties and coordinate with the arriving federal forces. That left Julia and Nahiosi to prevent the fire while ensuring Pete's men were caught red-handed. They reached the school just after midnight, moving like shadows through terrain that offered little concealment. The building appeared deserted, but careful observation revealed signs of recent activity. Fresh horse tracks, scattered equipment, systematic preparation that marked professional criminals. 6 of them. Nahiosi whispered, pointing toward figures barely visible in the poor light. Coal, oil, and torches ready. They're waiting for Pete to give the signal. What they were waiting for became apparent when Greasy Pete himself rode up accompanied by 2 more men. He'd come to personally oversee this final phase of Magnus's operation, ensuring nothing went wrong with the plan that would cement their victory. Julia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. They were outnumbered 9-2, facing professional killers who wouldn't hesitate to murder anyone who threatened their mission. But they'd come too far to back down now. The waiting ended when Pete struck his match and touched it to the first pile of oil-soaked kindling. Julia and Nahiosi moved simultaneously, stepping into the firelight with weapons ready. "Stop right there," Julia called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "We can see what you're doing, and there are witnesses present." What followed was chaos incarnate. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Pete's men scattered for cover, their carefully planned operation dissolving into desperate combat. Julia found herself pinned behind a water trough, while bullets chipped splinters from the wooden sides, but her primary concern was protecting Miss Nora's position long enough to document the crime. The battle raged with savage intensity, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness like deadly fireflies. Nahiosi moved through the chaos with predatory grace, his rifle speaking with careful precision, while Julia contributed what she could, using her knowledge of the school's layout to anticipate where Pete's men would seek cover. The turning point came when Quiet Will arrived with a group of honest townspeople who had followed the sound of gunfire. Faced with multiple witnesses and legal authority, most of the hired guns threw down their weapons and surrendered, rather than face charges of arson and conspiracy. But Greasy Pete wasn't finished. Cornered and desperate, he made one last attempt to complete his mission, lunging toward the oil-soaked building with a burning torch clutched in his hand. Julia intercepted him, tackling him around the waist and sending them both crashing into the dirt. The torch flew from his grasp, landing harmlessly in a cleared area, but Pete recovered quickly, his hands closing around her throat with murderous intent. "Should have minded your own business." He snarled, his face twisted with rage. "Magnus offered you everything's security wealth position. Instead, you choose to side with savages and troublemakers." Julia clawed at his hands, her vision beginning to darken. But Nahiosi was already there, his knife at Pete's throat. The would-be arsonist released her, immediately raising his hands in surrender. "It's over, Pete," Nahiosi said quietly. "You're going to tell everyone exactly what Magnus ordered you to do and why." What poured out in the hours that followed was a comprehensive confession that detailed Magnus's entire criminal enterprise. The railroad development scheme, the systematic murder of obstacles, the false flag operations designed to justify military intervention, all of it documented by Miss Nora's careful notes and Quiet Will's legal authority. But perhaps the most crucial revelation came when Pete, desperate to save his own life, produced a packet of letters from Magnus, containing explicit orders for the various raids and assassinations. The documents provided legal proof of premeditated murder that no court could ignore. As dawn broke over the Agency Day school painting the eastern sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Julia found herself standing beside Nahiosi while they watched Pete being loaded into a wagon for transport to territorial headquarters. Around them, the evidence of Magnus's crimes was being carefully preserved for the trials that would follow. "It's really over," she said quietly, scarcely able to believe their ordeal had finally ended. "This part is over," Nahiosi agreed. "But the rest is just beginning." The territorial courthouse had never witnessed a gathering like the one that assembled for Magnus's trial. Word of the evidence had spread throughout the territory, drawing spectators, officials, and interested parties from settlements 50 miles away in every direction. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating, building from Pete's detailed confession through layers of corroborating evidence. Miss Nora's photographs and documentation provided unassailable proof of the attempted arson, while the seized correspondence revealed the full scope of Magnus's criminal enterprise. But it was Magnus himself who sealed his own fate. Convinced that his superior intellect and social position would allow him to manipulate the proceedings, he insisted on taking the stand in his own defense. Under cross-examination, his carefully maintained facade began to crumble, revealing glimpses of the arrogance and contempt that had always lurked beneath his cultured exterior. When confronted directly with the evidence of his crimes, he grew defensive and openly hostile. "You murdered my father in cold blood," Julia said when given the opportunity to question her former tormentor. "I eliminated an obstacle to progress and development," Magnus replied with chilling matter-of-factness. "Your father's surveying reports would have established water precedents that interfered with legitimate business interests. Sometimes, individual interests must be sacrificed for the greater good." "And my mother?" Nahiosi asked, speaking for the first time during the proceedings. "What was her crime?" "The old woman's influence was preventing rational land use decisions," Magnus answered without hesitation. "She convinced other tribal leaders to reject perfectly reasonable offers for their worthless hunting grounds. Her removal was a necessary step in bringing civilization to this territory." The courtroom erupted in shock and outrage at his casual admission of murder. Even the defense attorney looked stunned by his client's self-incrimination. But Magnus was beyond caring about legal consequences. His schemes had been exposed, his empire destroyed, his carefully laid plans reduced to nothing. In his twisted logic, he seemed to believe that explaining his motives would somehow justify his actions. "I came to this territory to build something lasting." He continued, his voice rising with passion. "Railroad cities, industries that would benefit thousands of people for generations to come. If that required removing a few obstacles, eliminating some backwards individuals who couldn't understand progress, then so be it. History will vindicate my vision, even if this provincial court cannot." The jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes before returning unanimous guilty verdicts on all charges. Judge Harrison's sentencing was swift and final death, by hanging to be carried out within 2 weeks. As Magnus was led away in chains, still ranting about progress and civilization, Julia felt a profound sense of closure settling over her like a comfortable blanket. Justice had been done not just for her father and Nahiosi's mother, but for all the innocent people who had suffered under Magnus's reign of terror. The weeks that followed brought reconstruction that went far beyond repairing physical damage. Willow Springs had to rebuild its social fabric, creating new institutions based on cooperation rather than exploitation. Quiet Will became sheriff with overwhelming community support, bringing integrity to an office that had been thoroughly corrupted. Dr. Remy's practice flourished as people found themselves free to seek honest medical care. Miss Nora's school expanded to admit a few Lakota children by petition the following year, her bicultural education becoming a model for other frontier settlements. Hugh Morrison regained control of his farm and his dignity, the fraudulent debts that had nearly destroyed him officially nullified by territorial courts. More importantly, he signed a water-sharing agreement with Nahiosi's band, establishing the kind of cooperative relationship that could serve as a foundation for lasting peace. And through it all, Julia and Nahiosi grew closer, their partnership deepening from desperate alliance into something approaching genuine love. They spent long hours talking beside the creek that ran through Hugh's property, sharing stories of their childhoods and families, building the foundation any lasting relationship required. In my culture, Nahiosi told her one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in magnificent colors, marriage isn't just joining two people, but joining two ways of seeing the world. It requires both partners to become something new while honoring what they were before. What would that mean for us? Julia asked, settling comfortably against his shoulder. It means we don't have to choose between being white or Lakota, he replied thoughtfully. We can choose to be something that honors both traditions while creating something new for our children. Their wedding the following spring reflected the bicultural nature of their relationship. The ceremony was conducted by a traveling minister, but the celebration included both Methodist hymns and Lakota chants, fiddle music, and ceremonial drums, creating a unique fusion that somehow made everyone feel welcome. But the day's most meaningful moment came during a quiet interlude, when they slipped away from the festivities to share a private conversation by the creek where they had spent so many hours planning their future together. Do you ever wonder what your father would think? Nahiosi asked gently. I believe he would be proud, Julia replied after considering the question. Not because I married you specifically, but because I chose to build something positive from the tragedy he died trying to prevent. He always said the frontier needed people who could bring different groups together instead of driving them apart. As if summoned by their conversation, young Yaji appeared at the creek's edge with his fishing line, excited about something he'd caught. The object proved to be a small medallion, corroded by months underwater, but still recognizable as a surveyor's marker. Julia took it with trembling fingers, turning it over to reveal initials engraved on the reverse RM. Robert Morrison, she whispered. My father's surveyor medallion. As she examined the medallion more closely, she realized it represented more than just a memento. Its presence in this creek in traditional Lakota territory suggested her father had been here before, not as a victim, but as someone who had established peaceful relationships with the indigenous community. He knew this place, Nahiosi observed. Your father was surveying here years ago, probably when you were still a child. The revelation provided the final piece of a puzzle that had haunted Julia since their arrival. Her father's choice of destination hadn't been random. He'd been returning to an area he knew well, intending to establish a homestead, where he'd previously made peaceful contact with Lakota people. The blizzard, Julia said suddenly. When I was 10, and we sheltered with your people, that wasn't accidental. My father knew your camp was there because he'd been there before. Nahiosi nodded slowly. My mother spoke of a white surveyor who came in peace, who gave gifts to children and promised to return with his family. She said he respected our ways and learned some of our language. The discovery transformed Julia's understanding of her family's history. Her father's death hadn't been random tragedy. It had been the destruction of a carefully planned homecoming orchestrated by Magnus to prevent legitimate claims that would have interfered with his schemes. But the medallion also represented something hopeful, proof that peaceful cooperation had been possible before Magnus's divide-and-conquer tactics poisoned relationships between communities. Your father was building bridges. Nahiosi said softly. He tried to show that different peoples could work together. Now his daughter has finished what he started. As they walked back toward their wedding celebration, Julia carried with her a sense of completion that went beyond personal happiness. The medallion represented a connection to her father's vision that had survived tragedy and corruption, finding expression in the life she and Nahiosi were building together. The celebration continued until well after midnight, with musicians playing and couples dancing under starlit sky. Julia and Nahiosi joined the dancing when custom required, but spent most of the evening talking with friends and family who had supported them through their struggle for justice. Hugh Morrison, looking healthier than he had in years, raised a toast that brought tears to Julia's eyes. To my niece and her husband, who proved that love is stronger than hate, and that the best response to those who try to destroy us is to build something beautiful from the pieces they leave behind. As the celebration wound down and guests made their way home through the warm spring night, Julia and Nahiosi found themselves alone on the porch of the cabin they'd built together, watching the last embers of the celebration fire fade to glowing coals. "What comes next?" Julia asked, leaning against his shoulder with the contentment of someone who had found her place in the world. "Tomorrow we start building the rest of our lives," Nahiosi replied. "Next month we help with the planting. Next winter we sit by our own fire and tell stories to our own children. Next spring we watch those children learn to walk between two worlds with confidence that comes from being loved by both." Julia smiled at the practical optimism that had become one of the things she treasured most about her husband. He possessed the warrior's ability to focus on immediate necessities while maintaining faith in long-term possibilities, a combination perfectly suited to frontier life's demands. As they prepared to begin their married life together, Julia touched the small beaded charm that still hung around her neck. The simple ornament had carried her through the darkest period of her life and into circumstances that had transformed her from a frightened young woman into someone capable of fighting for justice and building bridges between different worlds. The charm would eventually pass to their children and grandchildren, becoming a family heirloom, carrying the story of how courage and kindness had triumphed over hatred and greed in the early days of territorial settlement. For now it was enough that Julia Morrison had become Julia Morrison Nahiosi, and that the girl from the blizzard had found her way home to the warrior, who had carved her a fox from bone and beads, claiming her heart across years and cultures, and all the forces that had sought to keep them apart. The prairie wind stirred the cottonwood leaves as they walked into their cabin together, ready to begin the rest of their lives as partners in the great adventure of building something lasting from the raw materials of the American frontier. Behind them, Willow Springs settled into peaceful sleep, secure in the knowledge that justice had been done, and that the future held promise rather than fear. The beaded charm pressed warm against Julia's chest as she prepared for her wedding night, carrying the blessings of a Lakota mother who had taught her son that kindness offered freely would return tenfold, and the prayers of a white father who had believed different peoples could find common ground if they approached each other with open hearts and honest intentions. Outside their window, ancient stars wheeled overhead, in patterns that had guided travelers and lovers since time began, bearing witness to the bonds that had formed between two people from different worlds who had discovered that love was indeed stronger than all the forces that sought to divide them. The battle for Willow Springs was over. The work of building a better future had begun.